Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this fifth session of our Transformative Finance Lab session. My name is Anja König. I lead the Transformative Finance Initiative at EVPA. I'm here with my colleague, Peter, who also works on the Transformative Finance Lab project together with me. And of course, our guest for today, Dominik Hofstetter of the TransCap Initiative. Before we start the conversation with Dominic, just a bit of a background about EVPA and why we're doing this. So EVPA embarked on a journey of transformative finance some time ago. We found out, and probably it's not a surprise to many of you, that the societal challenges that we're facing cannot be addressed by individual actors. They require collaboration, but they also require a different approach to investing and engaging in these complex and unpredictable challenges. And this is why we're saying, as EVPA, as a community of investors for impact, would like to help make investing for impact more transformative. That's our main objective. Last year, we launched the Collab Award to bring visibility to those in our community that are already engaging on system practices and on collaboration practices and make them more visible. We'll follow up with some activities this year to bring them closer together, foster peer learning and exchange. But also this year, we started to design the Transformative Finance Lab, which is more even in the direction of providing co-creation, a space for co-creation, rather than just helping with peer learning amongst our community. So I said earlier, it's about co-creating, providing a space for co-creation, but honestly, we don't know exactly what it will be. This is as much as we know. We know it will involve a diverse range of different actors, that's for sure. It will also bring together organizations across the spectrum of capital. We also know that. And we will use explorative and experimental methods to bring people together. But other than that, we don't know much, and this is why we embarked on this process to find out more. There are certain steps that we are undertaking. This interview process is one of these steps that we are undertaking. We are embarking on public interviews because we want to give everybody the opportunity to actually attend these sessions, but at the same time, we are also recording the session and providing transcripts so that later on we'll have a whole library of resources, and that we also want to make available whoever is interested in either working with us or working on a similar process within their communities, so that we thought this is actually also a contribution we can make to the broader ecosystem. We're also in the process of reaching out to interested organization and interesting organization at the same time, who we want to engage with and who we want to engage with on designing actually the Transformative Finance Lab. We will have an Impact for Breakfast session on the 30th of March. We'll send out the invites very soon, but whoever knows the community, sign up for the global network, and then you will automatically receive the invite. We're also preparing a design workshop in May. We'll also bring together different funders and other actors who are interested in helping us and contributing to shaping the Transformative Finance Lab at EVPA. And we will start later this year with prototyping an actual Transformative Finance Lab on the topic of education. But we are developing at the moment a generic methodology. So it is not only about education, it can be about any other field that we can apply this methodology to. So now it's my real pleasure to welcome Dominik Hofstetter. We've been in touch for quite some time on Dominik's great ideas and concepts that he provided on on the Transformative Capital Initiative, how it was originally called. He is the space builder at the Transformative Capital Initiative. And what really inspired me and made me invite him to this session is first the focus that it has a specific focus on finance, and not only finance as such, but really the capital markets and financial markets. So there's a real interest to transform the way finance works. And this is really supported with a very sound methodology and conceptual basis that you'll find on their website. There's also another aspect that I find quite interesting is about the intentionality and making really the mindset also topic of the TransCap initiative, as well as the methodologies that you will be using or you are already using that are very much of interest to us as part of the Transformative Finance Lab design process. So I stopped there and just like to invite Dominik to tell us a little bit more about how you came up with this idea, a little bit of a background on the systemic perspective in investing, and also how actually the TransCap initiative works in practice. And we can then engage in a more, informal conversation also with our participants.
Great, thank you, Anja, for the kind introduction and your interest in the work and the invitation to participate in this interview series. So the origin story of TransCap Initiative is closely connected to the work that Climate Kick has been doing over the past 10 years. Climate Kick is Europe's largest climate innovation initiative and has originally been incubated by the European Commission through an instrument called the EIT, the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. For the first 8 years or so of Climate Kick's existence, it has focused mostly on the traditional type of innovation, single point solutions to very specific problems, often of a technological nature. And then at the time, at around 2017, we've gone through a strategy review and took a very hard look in the mirror and asked ourselves, what have we actually accomplished other than a great many outputs that we've been able and quite proud to report on? And we realized that we actually, Climate Kick has actually not been hugely successful at triggering systemic change of the kinds that the scientific community is now asking for. So that prompted the strategy change, de-emphasizing single point solution in favor of systems innovation. And by that, Climate Kick means the orchestration of multiple levers of change, technology being one of them, but also policy, education, citizen engagement, norms and values, and finance, obviously. And in the context of that strategy pivot, the question arose, what is the role that investment capital plays in driving systems transformation in the real economy? And I'm saying that deliberately because it's important to understand that the starting point is the need of a real economy system like a city or a region or a landscape or a coastal zone. It's not actually the need of the financial sector or what we call the financial industry. Mm-hmm. So what we're interested in figuring out is how to program and deploy money as one of several levers of change in real economy systems. Now that obviously has ramifications for the way the financial industry shows up. The banks, the investment managers, the financial intermediaries, the way they show up to the challenge. But unlike most sustainable finance initiatives, we don't start from the needs and perspectives of the financial industry. We start from the need and perspective of the real economy systems and try and work ourselves backwards into the financial industry. In essence, the TransCap logic, or what we're trying to develop with systemic investing, or what we call systemic investing, it's quite simple. It's the marriage of systems thinking and finance practice in the context of sustainability challenges. And as we embarked on that journey about 3 years ago, we very quickly realized that when you try and bring the two together, there's not actually a whole lot of theory and intellectual concepts that are readily available and actionable for finance practitioners. So we realized that we needed to do quite a bit of original kind of research work and innovation work to define the field, conceptualize it, make it actionable, and that wouldn't just be done through desk research, but it actually needed to be done through, both theoretical and conceptual work, but also practical work and social work, so field building work, all happening in a coordinated and intertwined fashion. And that then became the blueprint for what is now shaping up as the TransCap Initiative, a collaborative, multi-stakeholder endeavor. Some people call it a community of practice, others call it an action network, but it's ultimately, we call it a space, a structure, an umbrella construct under which a great many organizations and different types of factors come together to collaborate toward a common purpose. And that space rests on three main pillars in terms of its, the way it makes sense of its work program: research, prototyping, and field building. And that's how we structure in more detail the different activities that we want to undertake, and also the different outputs that we want to produce in order to achieve a certain, set of outcomes that feed into the ultimate purpose of the initiative.
Perfect. Actually, that's always the question. Are you through, or do I interrupt?
I'll leave it at that for now, and
okay.
we can go into detail wherever you'd like.
It could have also been a theoretical pause, huh?
No, it wasn't.
The sense for something that's happening later on. This is so interesting. Actually, this is the first question that we normally ask: is really, how do you measure your success? How do you know that you're going to be successful? Let's assume there is Dominik in 5 years' time, looking back on the work that you've done since last year when the initiative was founded, or was it the year before? Was it in 2021?
I mean, it's a bit, there's a big question. When does something actually start? And we haven't, I guess I started on the process in April 2019, but there's not been any official launch of the initiative, nor do I think that we'll ever officially launch it, because it's just been gestation so far, and it will continue to gestate and then just grow from here.
Maybe the launch can be the in that sense the making it more public by publishing the white paper, and then maybe in 2020 in October, I think.
Maybe. I'm getting a message from Magnus saying that the sound quality isn't so good for me. Is that true for others as well?
There's a bit of an echo in the background.
Let me try and fix that real quick. Just give me 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, is this better, Magnus?
I think it's better, yes.
Okay,
Thanks,
brilliant.
Magnus, for mentioning that. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so your question was, how do we define success?
Yeah.
And this is where I think it's important to understand that the way we make sense of what we do is always on two levels. There is systemic investing as an investment logic, which is, the substance of what we're trying to develop, test, and ultimately mainstream. And there is a TransCap Initiative as a collaborative innovation space that is conceived and organized to make that happen. And so we need to evaluate success both on the level of the investment logic and the level of the organization or the initiative itself. Now, on the level of the investment logic, we have distilled, or we have derived from the essence of systemic investing, a list of maybe 20 different aspects or hypotheses of what systemic investing could mean, right? So it's not like we have come up with a definition where we said, this is it, and it sure will work. We subject the definition of it to the same process of discovery and exploration as we do the whole initiative. But we have an idea, a starting point at least, and we have a list of what we think aspects are that we'd like to demonstrate, or around which we'd like to experiment and generate demonstration effects for. So that sits at the level of the investment logic and is very closely connected to our theory of change. So why do you want to bring systems thinking to finance in the context of sustainability transitions? Why is that poised to unleash greater transformative effects than the traditional way of deploying purpose-driven capital? Now, above that, at the level of the initiative itself, we obviously have a number of, or will measure the success of the initiative against a number of indicators that have to do with the way the network or the community evolves. Right? That, I think, is a space where we can tap into best practices, because this type of collaborative innovation initiative or movement building, we're not the first to undertake that. It's actually discipline. So there are methods, there are people with huge amounts of experience in that space, best practices that we can lean on in terms of measuring the size and the quality of the network, the quality of the interconnections, the extent to which new collaborations spontaneously emerge from the connections that we nurture, et cetera, et cetera. So there, it's just, I guess, for us, a matter of tapping into those best practices. Now, I think the real question about success is, how do you avoid the fate of so many of these initiatives and labs, which is going into sort of the gray zone between being deaf and alive. So having just enough traction to keep going, but not actually enough to make a dent in the universe. And I think that's a real risk for the work that we do as well. And we'll certainly be able to sort of surf on that wave of initial excitement and momentum for maybe a few more years. And I have relatively high degree of confidence that we'll actually produce the outputs that we promise and make progress on the outcomes that we've set for ourselves. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually moving the dial in a meaningful way. And I don't have the answer of what what moving the dial for us means, but our ambition is to change mindsets and contribute to a paradigm in the world of finance. And there must be some way of conceptualizing what that means and translating that into indicators that allow us to get a quantitative, or at least a qualitative, sense of whether we're actually moving the dial.
Because that's what the investment logic really stands for. If you're saying there's this different levels, it seems to me that the investment logic illustrates maybe this idea of that having an impact on mindsets and changing the paradigms about how capital is deployed.
So, okay, so let me disambiguate that, because I think that's key. I think what a lot of these spaces or labs are good at is generating demonstration effects around very specific experiments that they run. Right? So you have a project, it goes off, it does something great, it comes up with, say, a new financial instrument, it gets that done, that's perfect, right? Now, what many of them struggle with is to find ways of scaling that experience to, scaling that up and out. So making sure that the knowledge that is being generated and the experience that is being had in the space diffuses beyond its original test bed and becomes more than just a beautiful exception, as some people put it. And one of the reasons is that I think these initiatives spend not enough time thinking about what that impact pathway looks like, what that diffusion pathway looks like, and the fact that you can't be in all of the locations, in all of the sectors, and all of the organizations that need to change their way of working. You can't be there physically, intellectually as a person, because that's not scalable. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of players and places that need transformation. So you need to think hard about how the results of your work diffuse and what that diffusion pathway looks like, and actually invest heavily up front in making sure those conduits are built. Right? So have a theory around what that impact pathway looks like, and baking into your work plan activities that give you at least a chance to reach audiences.
what would that mean in practice? If we say, let's start from the back. So you said one of your outcomes could be a prototype, for example, a financial product. Yeah. If we would like to think about the impact of such an financial product beyond a pilot case, how, in the cases that you are supporting now, the places that you are supporting, how do you go about diffusing? How do you go about reaching that scale? Or what's your thinking how this may happen? If I don't know how many of them have already come to that stage.
Yeah, so I think the key there is that the TransCap initiative is conceived essentially along its mission is essentially to trigger a mindset change, which implies that the most important thing it needs to do is narrative building and storytelling, which means that the practical work that we do serves a number of different purposes. Obviously, it serves the purpose of unleashing transformative change in the places where we operate, right? So in the case of, I'll give you an example, we have a project that Magdalena is leading in Switzerland on net zero mobility.
Yeah.
And so obviously we want to contribute to the positive change for decarbonizing the Swiss mobility system. But even more interesting to us is the evidence that this prototype will deliver and the storytelling potential that it will generate to talk about, to develop that bigger narrative and bring that bigger narrative out into the world. And there is actually a somewhat sound intellectual basis for that. So one example is a book here called Narrative Economics, which is published by Rob Schiller, which makes the case that economic and financial theories are basically all memes, and there's not always a logical rationale for why certain theories prevail, but they have really powerful stories backing them, and then that's part of why they diffuse and become orthodoxy. Now we want to lean into that and think hard about how do we tell the story of systems investing? How do we tell the story of systemic investing, and how do we leverage the potential of the prototypes to strengthen that story and bring it out into the world? And practically what that means is that you have that capability in the space from the beginning and you properly resource it. So communications doesn't just become, you don't communicate about something. Communications is what you do. It's your core competency, and everything else kind of feeds into that. It's a little probably too starkly worded like that, but it sort of I guess conveys the sentiment with how we look at storytelling and narrative development.
Just to jump in there very rudely, just because I can't keep quiet for long. There's something really interesting here, and I think the storytelling and narrative piece resonates quite strongly myself and done work before. But when you are storytelling and kind of doing this, about engaging audiences and bringing audiences in, and you don't start that from a point of view of saying, I'm going to tell you what you should be doing. You try and talk to them in ways that they understand. You bring them in, you make some form of self-interest for them. And I'm just really interested about this idea that you're kind of starting from the base, or starting from the system, and then going backwards into the financial systems. You're also trying to tell stories that bring people to your, for want of a better phrase, point of view or approach along the way. And I'm just wondering, how do you actually drive that? So in the storytelling piece, for example, what is it that encourages people to join you on this journey? If you're trying to encourage the financial sector, such like that, is it still a case of boiling it down to saying it's a better way of doing what you're doing, and therefore you will get your better returns, whatever you want them to be? Or is it something deeper than that, to try and question what's the purpose of the financial sector? Like, where does it sit on that? Because you could end up just talking to 20 people who agree with you, or you can try and go wider. And I'm just really interested in how you kind of do that kind of conversation, if that makes sense.
So the first observation that I've been having is that people feel drawn to the work for very different reasons. And almost everybody has their own say the one section in the white paper that they like the most. For some it's the systems thinking, for others it's the point about power dynamics, for still others it's the point about nesting, etc. And I'm fine with that. I have sort of given up to, I'm not trying to convince people of what are the most pertinent points, because that's the purpose of subjecting your initiative to emergence, right? You put something out, you see how the world reacts, and then you work with the signals, the positive signals that come back to you. Now, in order for that to happen in the first place, you have to communicate about it. And the publication of the white paper was preceded by a few blog posts that had quite a bit of resonance, but then the white paper really sort of served its purpose of exposing the ideas to a broader audience. And it has served that purpose in aggregate. It certainly has led to more, say, unexpected outcomes. And one of the unexpected outcomes for me was that, and maybe with hindsight, it would have been, able to anticipate that, but you're not actually going to find, I didn't find a lot of mainstream players step up. I mean, mainstream players, some of them have, say, innovation offices, and they're being paid to pay attention to stuff like new white papers, right? So you get somebody to read, and then occasionally you get a phone call set up. But very rarely do these phone calls proceed beyond the first engagement, right? So people want to be in the know, they want to be engaged, but because TransCap represents, or systemic investing represents, something that's paradigmatically different from where the mainstream currently is, the gap is too wide for them to engage. It's just simply not, I mean, they're not used to being part of a journey of exploration and discovery anyway. That's not the way to operate, right? They're being part of a transactional environment, and they're being incentivized to engage in transactions. So usually the response is, oh, this stuff is really interesting. Get back to me when you have deals. And that's fine, right? So we accept that, but it's not useful for where we are today. The stakeholders that have come through most productively are those who have been in the impact investing space for a number of years and have gone through a first learning cycle of impact investing and understand the limitations and opportunities of that. And understand that we need to keep not just involving the field incrementally, but actually also look at different structurally different approaches. And those happen to be in the high net worth space. Yeah. Individuals who've done impact investing, have gone through a first learning cycle, and now are ready to engage with something structurally new, both in terms of providing some resources, that it needs to do the public benefit work, but also then lending their investment platforms and their potential to influence other stakeholders as strategic assets into the space.
So what you're saying is that actually it requires someone to tell their peers about why this is important and how it works. So you need basically some ambassadors of system change that are from that community that you're trying to reach.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably true for every new idea, right? That comes to existence, that it spreads often like in a word of mouth type of way, at the beginning at least. And then maybe at some point you'll get to a point where you're being seen as relevant enough to catch the attention of mainstream media, and then maybe somebody writes about it. But in our case, it's certainly been true that if we mapped how that idea started to spread to the people who really matter for the next phase of this initiative, it was a little, fortuitous or maybe haphazard, or at least not in a way that we could have foreseen. I thought I had been under the impression that we'd be able to engage with institutional forms of capital sooner, but then came to realize the gap is just too large at the moment.
Is it also about the understanding about the different practices? Sorry, Peter, did I just interrupt? Yeah. Is it also
carry on?
A different understanding about the methods and practices that people just don't talk the same language? I've remember the impact days in Vienna 2-3 years ago. I think it was facilitated by Paul of the Landscape Finance Lab at that time. They then used some Lego pieces and made people puzzle together some vision of the future. I think it was something along those lines. And I wonder a little bit whether there are different ways how to make system change accessible to different segments of the community that you're trying to reach. Probably the innovators, the social enterprises, social innovation communities, they know these methodologies. They've used these methodologies for a long time. They're more aware of system practices because they have experienced them as well.
Yeah.
And for many financial institution professionals, decision makers, they may be a bit further away. And I think this is one of your messages in your white paper, saying actually we operate on secondary markets because we're not actually even intervening in the real world. There are some impact investors that are more closer to the real world than the many other financial institutions. So maybe these factors also contribute to the fact that it's more difficult to travel in that. Would you share that assessment? And if so, how can we move beyond it? How can we bring different kind of investors into that space of experiences, of experiencing what system change means?
So I would say that language certainly plays a role in here. I mean, the world of systems thinking is its whole, own discipline, and it has its vocabulary and its epistemologies, etc. The same is true for finance, and typically one community doesn't understand the other, right? So there's a bridging function that we need to play. But I think, beyond that, systems thinking is not actually, the basics of it are not actually that hard to comprehend. And there's some very powerful and accessible metaphors that we can use to convey the essence of it. And in my experience, that's usually conveying the basics is usually not the issue, and can in itself trigger, can go a long way triggering a mindset change. Once people have absorbed the basics of it, they very quickly move to the question, okay, so how does it work in practice? And there, obviously, we kind of reflect some of the demonstration effects of what that would look like. So we're working on that. But I think the challenge there then moves away from language towards questions of kind of practices and almost like internal organization. So the fact that systemic investing implies multi-asset class investing, and contrast that with the fact that most financial players are organized in asset classes, specific asset classes. So you have a real estate team, a venture team, a private equity team, a fixed income team, etc. And there's not actually a whole lot of collaboration across these asset classes because they're interested in individual investable propositions, which are often tailored around one individual asset belonging very clearly to one specific asset class. So there's a degree of, they're siloed, and there's a degree of specialization that inhibits them from thinking across these different asset classes. And it's practices like that, forms of internal organizations like that, that are then become the inhibitors for them to say, okay, I get it. We're going to come along, because there's nobody who's incentivized to cover different asset classes and actually start with the real economy's needs and then work backwards to how they need to show up as a financial institution rather than the other way around.
So it almost feels like you need someone to bring the different asset classes together on a specific project. Is that where you see your contribution as the TransCap Initiative? Is that?
I think you do, but you want to be careful, because if you bring together just different people from different departments, you're not going to resolve those barrier issues. It would actually be more, and this is what we're trying to do, I think it'll be more productive to bring capital owners who get it and who are willing to deploy across different asset classes. And those tend to be, the those sources of capital who are able to do that at the moment tend to be those that have a relatively low degree of institutionalization, so private wealth, right? So those people who can say, okay, I've got a pot of money, I want to invest in systems change. I'm actually kind of agnostic as to whether that's mostly through venture or fixed income or infrastructure finance. I want to invest into a, say, net zero mobility Switzerland portfolio.
Let's use this as a specific example. Let's how would it then work if this was the case? Maybe you can take us through some of the examples that you're working on.
So the process hypothesis that we have, right, to be tested and validated is that systemic investing starts with clarifying, well, picking a system of interest, such as mobility in Switzerland, and clarifying your intent, and doing so in a democratically legitimate fashion, right? So you can't just impose that system your own personal vision. You have to have a way to make sure that that is actually what the people affected by it want. In Switzerland, that's easy because we have a strong democracy and there's a government plan, and we have faith in that. And so we can basically say, okay, the approach to net zero mobility is electrification for the most part. So then you got to make sense of what that means. So map the system where it is today, where it needs to go, how it can get there. From that future systems map, you can start hypothesizing transition pathways. And from that, you can start characterizing the investable universe. Right? So obviously, we know there's going to be infrastructure need, charging infrastructure, privately owned, publicly owned, etc. There's going to be needs for vehicles, models, etc. There's going to be a need for a whole bunch of new business models around how these vehicle fleets are managed, how people interact with the cars, shared mobility concepts, etc. So you want to characterize that investable universe, and from that, compose investment portfolios that act upon sort of the different leverage points in that system, to take care of some of the barriers that stands in the way of that system organizing itself around that new techno-economic paradigm. So in Switzerland, it turns out that one of the huge bottlenecks is the deployment of charging infrastructure to privately owned multi-unit dwellings. Okay, it's extremely specific, but there's a problem there that if you are a private homeowner or you're an owner of a multi-unit building, you don't know how fast you can amortize your capital investments for a charging station because you don't know how fast your tenants are going to buy electric vehicles. So that creates an investment uncertainty, or it creates an uncertainty which is rooted in a financial problem that a systemic investment approach could potentially mitigate. And so you start, thinking through the system, you start trying to identify where the leverage points are and figure out how can deployment of capital start addressing them. Meanwhile, because we know that other things need to happen in that system, you start to look at who else is present in that system, who does what, on policy, on education, on citizen engagement, etc. And you try to align those investments with those other actors, which is not something that usually happens in finance because a traditional investor doesn't see her or his role to sort of going beyond the financial capital. Those things are almost like, in modern portfolio theory, that's exogenous to an investor's sphere of influence. It's just, it's the wider economy, that stuff is just given. But we argue that there is, in fact, a big role for investors to play on engaging these other levers of change and ensuring at least a degree of alignment, if not a degree of sort of co-creation of how it could all come together. Peter,
no, we can't hear you. No, still not. Something. No, still not. Oh, this is so unfortunate. Now I can ask my question. And I will then open it up. So you work on your technology, Peter, and then also everybody else who's here, Georgia, Magnus, maybe you also have some burning question that you'd like to ask. But just on this process, I find this really fascinating, that effectively you have this process of mapping the system and of identifying not only leverage points, if I understand you correctly, but really impact pathways. You identify really how they are supposed to develop, and maybe probably also some different scenarios, because you can't predict the future. So I assume that it also needs to be inbuilt somehow. And then out of that, you then package different investment opportunities really for different kind of investors almost. Huh? Is that how it works?
So yeah, so the point about transition pathways is this idea that a system can't actually just jump into different realities, right? It has a path dependency, comes from somewhere. There's vested interest, there's infrastructure lock-in, etc. So there are a limited set of pathways it can take going forward. In some cases, in the cases of the mobility system in Switzerland, it's kind of clear, right? So it'll be electrification. I mean, yes, some people throw around the idea of hydrogen-based mobility, but really all the signs are pointed toward electrification. And so the challenge becomes less one about figuring out what that future looks like, but more one of how do you actually catalyze it? How do you accelerate the transition? And how can you resolve some of the bottlenecks so that the system starts to self-organize itself the way it's happening in Norway at the moment, where that mobility system has reached its tipping point, and it's just going to be a matter of time now for internal combustion engines to be phased out. But I think crucially in our investment portfolios, we want to make sure that the assets within the portfolio are brought into strategic alignment. So, ideally in a way where there's actually, synergies, combinatorial effects that emerge from those being in the same portfolio and invested by the same people. So to give you an example, going back to the charging units at those multi-unit dwellings, usually that supply chain of vehicle charging is fragmented. So you have a developer of the charging technology, then you have an operator of that charging station, and oftentimes there's a company that finances that, and then you've got the consumer, etc. So wouldn't it be nice, or at least, that's what we're trying to figure out, what happens if you actually make investments in companies along that supply chain, and you structure those investments in a way that compel them to collaborate. So you don't just make an investment, like an equity investment, and say, use it for whatever purposes you have in your business plan. You almost like earmark it, and you say, we're going to make an investment in you, but we have a strategic interest attached to that. And we're going to put covenants or conditions in the investment agreement that compel you at least partially to go and pursue that strategic objective. So that's when you move away from the single asset investment paradigm into the strategic portfolio paradigm. Your assets are now in strategic alignment, and
it's exactly. And this is now Peter. Okay, go ahead.
So thank you for that. I mean, sorry for the technical problem. So that idea of having your full portfolio, moving towards the same aim, and I mean, simplistically, it's, I suppose, examples of that are things like, I don't know, the Gates Foundation investing in drug companies, but telling them where they want them to work and how they want to work is some early kind of forms of that. I'm just wondering about, in this system, which is system thinking, I mean, the role of government strikes me because, well, there's three things. Number one, the role of government, and where do you see that role being? Because when it comes to who has a vested interest, I think that this is about a system, and should be the role of government up to a point, possibly, if not getting into too much political theory, but what's the role of government there? The second piece I just wonder is that the trouble at the moment is that it's still basically philanthropy step on almost sometimes, it feels like, because you're looking at people who have capital they can deploy in a place that they wish to deploy it. So high net wealth individuals will have money, they'll say they want their whole portfolio to be on impact, and I'd particularly like to help Switzerland or North Korea. I just wonder how we kind of, there's a worry there about how do we stop that, and where do we kind of, how do you encourage that to be wider? And this is where I think the role of government might come in. And the third piece that just struck me in here is going back to this idea that you're looking for impact pathways to kind of send this more widely. So pardon the really bad English, but you know what I mean, like those impact pathways. Is the impact pathway here to show to the financial, if it's not government, is it financial markets? Because what you're showing is that you will get a better return. You're opening up different ways of capitalizing opportunities that are out there already, but you're not actually changing the system. All you're doing in that scenario, and that's being a bit challenging, but all you're doing in that scenario is saying, actually, your investment will be stronger. We can take out some of the risks, some of the uncertainty by offering you, look at this example we've done in Switzerland. People have made money back off the charging points or the bits along the way. And I just wonder, that's a big long question, but my tech didn't work right. So it was really just the role of government, the role of stepping away from it just being one individual who wants to do good somewhere doing it. And thirdly, how are you, that kind of thing about affecting change, are you affecting wholesale change, or are you just hoping to show the financial markets a different way of benefiting from investments that are already out there? Does that make sense? It's a very long question.
Fine. So role of government. Role of the government plays a huge role in shaping future markets, right? So that's Mariana Mazzucato is one of the most vocal voices on that, and calling for a return of entrepreneurial governments who really step away from laissez-faire to a much more directional policy. And I think overall that's the role of government. Government tends to lag, right? Because they depend on popular support for stuff, for measures for structural change. So they tend to lag. Well, I guess the question is who goes first, who moves first? And what we found is that high net worth individuals not only have, not only have the flexibility and agility to move fast, but they actually they can play an interesting role as norm entrepreneurs, sort of showing a different way of operating, a different way of working. Because if you think about it, the bulk of organizations in the financial industry, they're just service providers to asset owners. Now, pension funds are asset owners, but they are fiduciary asset owners, so they're hugely conservative. Sovereign funds are asset owners, but they are, large and difficult. And then that leaves, retail investors and, well, I guess a bunch of other institutional investors, but retail investors and high net worth individuals, and they can move fast. And so one of our theories is that we can start with high net worth individuals and leverage their flexibility to create these demonstration effects, but also to start shifting the conversation around norms, etc. Mm-hmm. So then how do we tap into financial markets? I think one of the things that we're cognizant of is that there's this expectation that there's somehow an entitlement for financial capital to reap the same financial returns at the same level of risk as has been the case in the past. Now, I think there's some very compelling arguments to be made that this sort of the win-win narrative that doing well by doing good is structurally flawed, and that the risk-return profile in a economy that goes through a fundamental structural transformation will not be as compelling as one that's been predicated on extracted paradigms. And so we're not submitting readily to this idea that we have to promise the same returns at the same level of risks to the financial markets. I think there's a conversation to be had about adjusting return expectations. How are we going to bring them along? That's to be seen. And ultimately, I think it will have to go through a combination of both changes in the normative position of, say, society as to what financial capital is here to do and here to serve, which is something that we can, hope to contribute to, but certainly, we're not going to, fundamentally change that. That's also to some degree a matter of the zeitgeist, right? Then people just evolve, society evolving. And then it's going to be also the role of government to decide how it wants capital at large to flow. But as we know from the EU taxonomy, that those processes are deeply flawed in their own rights, and it will take some while for it all to come into balance and actually land on something that's truly sustainable and not just an incremental tug away from where the vested interests currently are.
That's the really interesting bit, and I'm aware of time, but yeah, that's fair. Not having an answer, but that kind of thing about the role of government kind of coming back around and being responsive to society and changing society. Yeah, yeah, it's just, yeah, you can go round and round. I think you made a very good point earlier about being clear about what you are going to do and not going to do. I mean, for us, as we look at our lab process, there are things that we'd like to change, but maybe, you know, the best will in the world, it might not be us and it might not be this week. It's that kind of just picking.
Yeah. So, I mean, the one thing I want to say is that if you've, from my personal opinion is that if you start focusing on the interests of mainstream finance too early, you're going to anchor your initiative in in a mode of incrementalism, because you're trying to serve existing interests, and that will inhibit the degree to which you can actually be truly innovative. Because finance fundamentally is conservative, right? So even the capital labeled risk capital, the stuff that does venture capital, for instance, it invests in innovation, but it's not very innovative in how it does that. It's very conservative in its processes and paradigms and the frameworks that it uses to evaluate opportunities. And you're not going to get something structurally different if you focus on mainstream too early in the life of your lab.
On the other hand, you want to bring in the funders and the investors relatively early so that they own the process and understand what you're talking about, and also probably provide their perspective on, you know, the future way how finance can then contribute to change. To me, there's still this question that you're also asking as part of your hypothesis on transformation capital about what is the specific role of the funders? Could it not go beyond just funding, but would they have other means to influence the system that we are trying to change?
Yeah.
Rather than presenting a ready-made package by all sorts of actors who work together collaborative, and then here your package is ready, please fund it. No, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the question really is, when do we bring in the funders and investors, and which kind of investors and funders do we want to have relatively early? Which ones do we bring in maybe a bit later?
So my sort of guidance to that would be try and find the ones that are curious and don't come with a lot of conditions and a lot of preconceptions about how it should all work, but who are eager to be part of a learning journey. Okay, so once you've got that, try and find people who allow you to generate demonstration effects fast. So the more ready they are to engage, or make sort of readiness of engagement part of your first principles of how you shape up the space. Because those demonstration effects will be what will give you momentum, runway in the work that you do. It can't be about the ideas and the theories for too long only, right? At some point you have to show what it looks in practice. And yes, you probably want the mainstream around the table, but just be cognizant that comes at the cost, right? At least at the cost of paying attention to their interest in facilitating conversation, etc. I mean, we've mapped the number of sustainable finance initiatives out there, and we've stopped that somewhere at 120 because we thought it wouldn't make sense to go broader than that. And those are 120 very well-meaning and very well-conceived initiatives that are all trying to do something similar. But where very few of them move beyond the conversation, the convening, the learning conversation, the best practice sharing. Some manage to move to actual experimentation, where by actual, I mean skin is invested, right? Somebody makes and it actually moves money, right? Money is at risk. That's the ultimate test of whether something is attracting enough interest or not. And very few of those that manage to do that are able to take that next step in terms of making sure that this single experience diffuses to and starts impacting a broader set of actors.
Yeah, perfect. I realize I have been very bad at timekeeping. It's 3 minutes to the end of the hour. I don't know, Dominik, whether you have a few more minutes to stay with us, or you have to jump to the next meeting, because I would really like to give our participants also the opportunity to comment or react or ask some questions or whatever it may be, to just join the conversation. Magnus, Georgia, Madalena, maybe also, if you like. You don't have to. We can still fill the last 3 minutes.
If I may go, Anya, hello. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I'm on the move again, but I'm super glad that I was able to join this session. Fabulous conversation. I'm still wrapping my mind around some of the elements, but it really hit home that element of starting with the real needs on the ground in a mission area, in a given ecosystem, and then working the way back to the financial tools that we can put in service of it. And I'm coming here, and also what was last mentioned, going from the learning to more of a demonstration cases, putting resources at risk. And I think from the EU level, just reflecting on what we're doing now on the back of this EU sustainable finance taxonomy, it's taking its sweet time. It's maybe not as perfect as we would have hoped, but building on that, the new initiative that we're trying to do by using the EU guarantee capacity to actually de-risk and co-invest with asset owners around mission areas and shifts big buckets of finance into sustainability. It really speaks to me this whole way of thinking and how to better orient the EU exercise. But I want to come back and ask Dominik, coming back on the role of government, maybe if he can speak more directly on the EU. So I understand this TransCap initiative was supported by the EU in many ways. EU is doing plenty of things, but what other roles could there be and opportunities? Can the EU be this kind of ambassador for system change in one new ways that he can see from experience? Thanks a lot.
So look, the obvious entry point for the EU would be through its financial institutions under the InvestEU program, right? EIB, EIT, etc., maybe EBRD to some degree. And align some of their activities with some of the new, say, innovation paradigms that have been adopted at the level of Horizon Europe, right? So Horizon Europe is structured around missions, 5 large, hugely ambitious missions. And all of these missions have gigantic investment needs. But there is a misalignment between that mission logic and the way EIB and EIT are organized internally and the way that they think about their role, right? And it's still very deal by deal focused, single asset paradigms. And an obvious way would be to investigate what would a different way of working look like within the EIB to make capital available along a mission mindset. Now, we've had some of these conversations, but what's true for other mainstream players is true for the EU and the EIB as well, which is it'll take a while for them to create the structures and internal capacities to actually work along such a paradigm. But there's certainly enough sort of context in which we, could experiment of how that would actually, what that would look like.
Also with Georgia, we've been talking about these mission aligned investments and now talking about impact pathways. I wonder also whether the European Commission or any government institution would also not have the possibility to act more as a coordinator or convener, in a sense of first demonstrating possible impact pathways within certain mission areas and then show some investment opportunities. So almost be a sort of facilitator in that space. Government can have different roles, both as a market participant, as well as a regulator, as well as a convener and facilitator. And they have done so in some countries. In Australia, they've been very strong on that convening and sort of facilitating role. I'm just wondering whether
EU has started doing that along the 14 industrial ecosystems as part of the new industrial strategy, and social and proximity economy are one of those ecosystems. So there is now consultation still open on the transition pathways. Yes, in fact, on that. So we have started doing that in a broader way. And on more specific issues, so smaller ecosystems, so more tangible, we're also working with the EIB group at present to build some of those internal structure, as Dominic is saying, and in order to be able to align and channel the finance towards them. So perhaps interesting to explore. After this call, I don't want to steal the time, but I will get in touch. Thanks.
We still have more possibility, and the conversation doesn't have to stop there. I think there's so many ways we can, we should also merge our brains again and throw some ideas around in a more informal setting, because I think we all come from these perspectives, but trying to do something in a similar direction, it seems to me. So it makes a lot of sense to really find ways to bring different perspectives together, and so it doesn't have to be this 60-minute conversation only. We can,
I know, off record we should brainstorm much more.
Exactly. We can also edit the transcript later on and cut the video short, so no worries about that.
Okay.
I can even stop the recording here if you like. Shall we do that? Let's just stop the recording and